He laughs like he owns the room, a bark of amusement that fills the glass-walled auditorium and bounces off the chrome coffee urns, the kind of laugh that signals entitlement more than humor. People glance up from their laptops. A few smiles flicker and settle into comfortable assent. At the head of the table, a polished nameplate slides a sliver of light along the table. Grant Halstead, Chief Strategy Officer. He leans back, fingers steepled, a portrait of corporate ease. Across from him, Maya Carter keeps her posture deliberately ordinary. She is young enough to still be called junior in internal directories, sharp enough to be credited on the quarterly models that saved a client from a disastrous misstep, and steady enough to let the room's temperature rise around her without combusting. When the joke lands, a patronizing aside about her unexpected competence, she smiles. Not a concession, not a grin of defeat, a closed, small smile, the kind someone keeps for themselves. He expects discomfort. He expects her to blush, to fumble, to thank him for his mentoring. Instead, she makes a note in the same black notebook everyone assumes has meeting minutes. Her pen moves almost casually. He laughs again. Louder this time because power laughs are meant to multiply, to erase, to humiliate into oblivion. The room follows. Laughter, like a wave, laps at her shoes and retreats, leaving ripples on everyone's faces. A senior partner lets out an airy snort that might be mistaken for amusement. Two young associates exchange a look that is part sympathy, part calculation. Somewhere near the back, a client stifles a sound that might be pity. The joke is a test. The room has chosen a side. Maya does not answer him. If you're watching closely, you'll see the micro movements that tell you she is not broken. The way her shoulders do not slump. The precise hold of her eyes on the spreadsheet projected behind him. Her voice is not raised. Her face does not crumple. Dignity in her hands is quiet. It is a small moment, and that is why such moments are dangerous. A single mocking sentence can map a career in this company. Who belongs at the table? Who can pitch to clients? Who gets put on the fast track? For Maya, a junior analyst whose name still sometimes meets a hesitant eyebrow in the elevator, this sort of test is constant. For Grant Halstead, the test is not whether he belongs. It is how loudly he can prove it. If you like stories about comeuppance and quiet triumphs, hit like, someone would say now if this were one of those channels. If that line lands for you, go ahead. It's the kind of story people return for. But for the moment, the room is real and the sound is Grant's laugh. He jokes again, this time about her being surprisingly forward, as if aptitude is a novelty in a woman with her profile. Heads nod in the way people nod when they want to be seen as aligned with power. The client leans forward, interested in spectacle. Maya looks at the slide behind Grant, projected margins, a line item for a vendor acquisition, and then down at her notebook. Her pen has paused. She breathes in. The air in the room tastes like stale coffee and assumed superiority. This is where the story begins. The outward humiliation, yes, but also the hidden work that preceded it. People will remember the laugh. They will not initially remember the months of quiet maneuvering that made the laugh meaningless. You could mistake her calm for acceptance. That would be convenient for Grant. But she has long since learned that the theater of power rewards spectacle. It seldom punishes silence. So she chooses a different tactic. She will stage an answer that cannot be talked over. A few weeks earlier, months even, the building on 3rd Avenue had been another backdrop to the same play. Glass, voice, hierarchy. Maya had been sitting at the very same conference table when a vendor's CEO, small, profitable, considered expendable by Grant, had pitched a partnership that would have divested control to an outside consultancy. Grant had made the calculation, as he always did, this particular asset didn't deserve close attention. He delegated the negotiation to a junior associate, shrugged on a Friday and moved the conversation to golf. Maya watched the meeting, not only because it was material for her models, but because she took notes on behavior the way other analysts take notes on cash flow. There were patterns, whose names were invoked and whose were omitted, whose suggestions were singled out for praise and whose for correction. She learned that power was not always loud. Sometimes it was simply a habit. Interrupt, correct, exclude. Sometimes it was an assumption clothed in experience. After work that night, she opened a spreadsheet that no one knew she kept. It wasn't labeled plans or revenge. She never let language make the work dramatic. The sheet was precise: historical revenue, buyer interest, potential financing structures. She identified a small firm, Harrison Data Systems, a niche provider of analytics that supplied the kind of modular product Grant's team had been drinking in for months. Harrison had a tight client list, an intangible asset in its models, and a founder more interested in product than politics. In the calculus of corporate moves, it was a plausible acquisition, a piece that could be folded into a larger strategy without drawing the kind of attention a takeover always invites. There is no romance in corporate purchase plans, only arithmetic and patience. Over the next year, Maya built what she could: capital saved from modest bonuses, a few angel contacts from a finance club she'd joined in a moment of mid-career curiosity, introductions from an adjunct professor who liked her rigor. She read contracts late into the night. She learned the art of the share purchase agreement, the paperwork that, simply put, transfers equity from sellers to buyers. A character on a call later will explain in plain terms. A share purchase agreement is the document that says who owns the company now. She learned to speak to lawyers without sounding green. She did not romanticize this. She did not imagine a single document could dismantle a culture. She knew the risk of hubris on both sides. So she kept the file status neutral, an acquisition chain that was lawful, boring, and unnoticed. When lawyers needed signatures, she signed. When escrow needed a confirmation, the paperwork routed through her email. When counsel asked if it should be filed in the state registry, she agreed. The press release went out last Wednesday. No fanfare, just a short statement on a legal newsfeed. An obligatory quote from an underused founder, relieved to hand off administrative burdens. The purchase was unglamorous and therefore secure. Last week, she whispered to herself when she scrolled the registry. It read like a date and a comma and a closure. Last week. Two little words that, when spoken in the right room and with the right proof, could topple the carefully manufactured crest of someone's assumed superiority. Grant, by profession, never learns that patience can be weaponized against him. His pride is a reflex. He equates volume with authority and spectacle with strategy. In meetings, his voice is always the first to fill a silence, as if silence were a vacuum needing to be eclipsed. He prides himself on reading a room. What he really means is that he reads the margins and makes a decision for everyone in the center. He mistakes charisma for competence because charisma buys applause. There are small signs of his pattern. At the quarterly awards dinner, he once joked about a colleague's accent to a table of new analysts and laughed as if explanation weren't necessary. At a client dinner, he corrected the billing of an account manager, publicly, brusquely, because it allowed him a performative demonstration of expertise. People joked afterwards about his gallows humor. People who mattered nodded. Those who didn't nodded less loudly. In private, some whispered about toxicity, but whispers are rarely a match for a C-level title. Maya had watched him do this before. She had been on the receiving end of his micro-corrections, a helpful suggestion that felt like a correction in public, a patronizing nice try in front of a client. Each of those moments accumulated like small taxes on her confidence, but she did not save the resentment. She saved the moves that would make those incidents matter. She did it methodically. She made a list of stakeholders who had quietly defected from Grant's camp over the years, partners who had grown tired of his edge, mid-level managers who had seen deals blow up after his impulsive meddling. She cultivated one, Elena Park, a mid-senior counsel who had clashed with Grant once too often in a negotiation over liability. Elena hated bullying. She was precise, private, and willing to put a stamp on a filing for the correct price. Elena became the first tangible ally, someone who would, if necessary, validate the timestamp on a record before a room that still believed in theatrical proofs. Then there was the founder of Harrison, Benji Harrison, quiet, utterly focused on product, allergic to the spectacle of boardroom politics. When Benji needed an exit to focus on innovation, Maya was present at the right moment with the right offer, clean, fair, and legally enforceable. For the founder, selling to someone who promised continuity and product development made sense. For Maya, the small firm was a strategic lever. Her acquisition was not a coup staged to humiliate. It was a business decision executed on market terms. But it was personal in this way. It changed the field in which Grant thought he was invincible. His entitlement assumed that control was a function of title and tenure. Ownership is different. Ownership can be quiet, and when ownership is revealed, it recalibrates incitement. Back in the conference room, Grant is still making his case with the ease of someone who quotes other people's ideas and claims them with confidence. The client is watching his charm like a performance. Maya's voice had been mild during the deck presentation, insightful, crisp, full of numbers that actually supported a strategy. But when Grant derided her, the sound of his laughter opened a fissure in the day's ritual. She had arranged for the reveal to happen on neutral ground, and all hands where the optics could not be controlled by him, where the public nature of the announcement would cut through the theater of his authority. But she also knew that to make the moment undeniable, she needed to make it immediate. Proof in hand, counsel present, and a channel for the company's internal news to carry the fact into the hands of every stakeholder. Her folder contains what she needs: a printed registry entry stamped with the date, last week, the official signature of the corporate registrar, Elena's initial on the cover page, and a one-line press release that had already been distributed to legal feeds and trade journals. On the back, not visible to anyone without a sharp eye, is the escrow confirmation: funds cleared, signatures logged, transfer effective. The documents are banal to anyone not trained to read them. To someone who runs on status, they look like paper. To the company and to the world, they are the authority of law and business. Moments like this are not theatrical because of the words themselves. They are theatrical because of timing. She has rehearsed the calm. She plans no shout. She wants not to humiliate but to correct the record. When the room's laughter peaks, she will speak, not to punish but to place an incontestable fact in front of everyone who had been willing to accept the joke. Grant embarrasses himself without trying. He doubles down. He dismisses the nuance of Maya's data with a wave, calls it ambitious, and then, perhaps out of habit, compares ambition with overreach. Bold, he says, and the way he says it is meant to be a scalpel. His joke is a salvo designed to make the team align behind him. The air changes. You could point to 100 micro-reactions. A phone protruding from a pocket at an angle that suggests recording. A whisper from someone who remembers an old grievance. The way a junior analyst straightens as if in preparation for fallout. A woman from HR, Marta Reyes, glances toward the back door, where the glass reflects a corridor of motion. Marty has fielded complaints about culture. She knows the difference between a momentary lapse and a pattern that should be addressed. Her eyes flick to the ceiling as if searching for a script. Maya closes her notebook. She sets her pen down with a sound that seems louder now than it should be. People in the room sense the change before they register it. It is the volume of patience turning to action. Grant, Maya says. Her voice is cool and even, not loud, but perfectly audible above the post-laughter hum. Before we move on, there's something I want to make clear. Something factual. It is a modest preface. It is not dramatic. It is a hand extended for clarity. Grant, surprised at being interrupted, blinks. He wears the expression of someone used to controlling the flow of interruptions. He opens his mouth, but Maya does not let him finish. There is a small, almost invisible motion as she slides a single sheet across the table toward him. The registry printout. It is white and ordinary. The ink looks familiar. The date is last week. Grant squints at the page. Elena, in the seat 2 down, leans forward to look. People lean. When you lean in a meeting, it signifies you're trying to read beyond the rhetoric. Maya speaks again, softer. I bought his company last week. The sentence hangs like a chord resolving. There is no flourish. She does not say your company because in business formality matters. Precision protects dignity. Grant's face composes itself into amusement. He laughs, a reflex more than a choice. But this time the laugh's edges are frayed. There is a stutter of disbelief at its center. He pats the page as if to shoo a fly. What are you talking about? His voice is too loud for the gravity of the claim. From a pocket, Elena produces her phone, quick as a legal reflex, and flips the screen toward the group. The registered filing is there on the state's business portal, a time-stamped entry with the company's new ownership logged with the transfer clause. Elena explains in her precise, unromantic way, it's a share purchase agreement. Basically, the seller transferred their shares to the buyer, and the state recorded the transfer. The explanation lands like a translation. Legalese turned into a single clinchable fact. There is a beat of silence that arrives like a physical thing. Laughter dies awkwardly, the way a candle's flame dies when smothered. Phones are out now. It's hard not to record this. A few people begin murmuring, "No way. Is this real?" But their voices are thin beneath the new fact. Grant's hand finds his water glass for composure. He laughs again, a short, nervous sound. "Is this a joke?" he asks. But the question has no pathway to humor. It is a plea for denial. Maya slides out the press release, folded crisply. "The transaction closed last Wednesday," she says. "Escrow confirmation is attached." She lets the simple, boring business language do its work. The words don't scream. They simply place evidence on the table. Evidence in a room used to theatrical proclamations is a kind of antiseptic. A junior associate, Jordan, who sits between them, looks pale. He had been one of the analysts assigned to a due diligence checklist last month and thought it odd that the task was shelved. He had assumed it was an administrative snafu. Now his eyes track the documents the way a reader tracks a reveal in a novel. "Elena," he says quietly, "can you confirm the timestamp?" Elena nods and taps her screen. "Filed at 09:14 last Wednesday," she says. "Corporate registry shows transfer effective as of the 14th. "Last week," someone echoes, as if the calendar date is itself a hammer. Around the room, phones click. Someone sends a message into the company Slack, a screenshot of Elena's phone with the registry entry. The sound of a message being sent is banal and profound at once. Corporate channels that usually carry project updates now begin to carry the shape of scandal. Reactions, question marks, private messages to HR. Grant's face narrows. The man's laugh, which had once been the room's weather, is now an anachronism. He fumbles for a response that will restore the theater. "Ms. Carter," he begins, the politeness strained. "I appreciate initiative, but—" He reaches for the ritual of control. Deflection, diminution, humor. Maya meets his attempt with an even, brief look. "This isn't about you," she says. "It's about the fact. I made a purchase. The records reflect that purchase. If there are operational questions, contracts, client transitions, legal and integration will handle it. That work has started." Her voice is not triumphant. It is administrative. A sentence that could be read as a triumph of personal vindication, instead reads as a memo. There is a tremor among the senior partners at the table who had been on the margins of Grant's orbit. The alternation between "is this true" and "how did I miss this" passes like a switch being flipped. Mullins, a board member present for the pitch, turns his head toward the projection screen as if trying to find the point where the plot diverged. The client present is suddenly considering whether their contract with Harrison is affected. Relationships are not abstract here. Grant's voice slides for a fraction of a second into something like pleading. "Who authorized this? What agreement do you have with our vendor?" He tries to invoke procedure, an attempt to make a rumor procedural and thus ignorable. But procedure requires paperwork. She has paperwork. "You'll find the transaction is lawful and in order," Maya says. "Benji Harrison and his counsel accepted my offer. The sellers signed. Escrow cleared. Counsel is on standby for any integration questions." She slides the packed folder toward Elena, who nods once and tucks a label tab to the side that reads, "Transaction Docs, Harrison Data Systems." The room's temperature shifts from the warm glow of spectacle to the frost of documentation. People start to think in terms of next steps. HR will need to log any implications for teams. Client leads will need to be briefed. The PR team, often a distant function, will need to prepare messaging to explain the acquisition if the press picks it up. The mechanics of corporate life are dull and therefore precise. They are weapons against the theater of personality. Grant makes a move to regain control by invoking a communal narrative he often uses. We are a team. We make decisions together. We don't. He pauses, searching for a consensus he no longer commands. His hand waves in the air like a man trying to redirect traffic. Marta from HR speaks up, not to defend Grant but to assert procedure. We need to assess conflicts of interest and client impacts, she says. Her tone is neutral. The only reason neutrality is significant is because neutrality often protects power. Here it demonstrates policy. But the public moment has already pierced the private assumptions. People whisper. A senior account director whispers to another, "If this goes to the board, Grant's role will be questioned." The phrase is a pebble dropped into the previously calm pond. Ripples arrive in the form of glances and a quick message sent to the general Slack channel by a curious intern. Did anyone else just see this? The company, accustomed to carefully curated information, gets its facts messy. Grant's composure fragments in small human ways. He reaches for his phone, but his hand shakes. He pulls up his calendar, maybe to find an emergency meeting to claim process, maybe to find a way to redirect attention. His smile, which had been his currency, falters. There is a brief animal panic. He looks around the room to see who will stand with him. A few older partners are silent. Solidarity sometimes follows convenience. Maya, meanwhile, does not gloat. Her eyes hold not triumph but measurement. She knows the reveal is not the end. Ownership is a lever, not a scalpel. She has seen, in her own research and in conversations with mentors, how companies often settle the noise with an email, a private conversation, and a reassertion of normalcy. She knows that systems often protect themselves, but this is not about spectacle. It is about recalibration. When someone makes a habit of publicly diminishing others, the consequence need not be catastrophe. It can be a correction in the ledger of reputation. The registry stamp, she knows, has the capacity to force conversation. That conversation is, for a moment at least, unignorable. Outside the building, through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city moves on, people on their phones crossing the street, a bus exhaling passengers. Inside the room, the microscene of human relations has shifted. The projectors keep humming. The coffee urns keep bubbling. People clear their throats. Someone asks a practical question about the client's timeline. The meeting was supposed to be about projections. Now it is about people. Grant stands. His movement is made to be seen as control, but it looks precarious. We need to step aside and discuss this with legal, he says. It is as if the ritual of invoking legal will give him time to salvage a narrative. Calling counsel is a move both tactical and theatrical. It signals procedure and buys breathing room. Elena, across the table, already has her legal tone, steady, unhurried. She is not fully on Maya's payroll. She's an ally because legality is her domain and truth is her method. The room shuffles. Chairs scrape. Phones stop recording for a moment. People exchange compressed, hurried messages. There will be an internal note. Someone will draft a communication to clients. Someone will check the board calendar. The mechanism of corporate life begins to spin, a centrifuge that can either unravel a man's authority or wrap him in process. Both are possible outcomes. Grant's expression is now clinical. He is no longer delivering a performance, he is diagnosing the damage. He will call his network. He will place a late-night message to a board member who owes him a favor. He will begin to assemble responses. He is practiced at this. He knows how to bait sympathy. He will, if necessary, paint this as an administrative oversight that will be corrected. Maya remains seated, hands folded. Her posture is unremarkable, but it is also a choice. There is a small, visible mark on her pen where the ink has been pressed in the hour before, an imprint of focus. Her heart beats, but quietly. She knows what can happen next. Rumors, quiet calls, reputational calendars filled with damage control. She also knows the limits of one document in dismantling a system. She intends to press only to the point of clarity. For her, the story is not about demolishing a person, but about refusing to be reduced in public. Around the table, The client looks between Grant and Maya, as if trying to pick the direction of a company by auditioning its leaders. Clients tilt toward stability. In corporate moments like this, stability is a commodity. Some will call their procurement teams tonight. Some will wait to see how the company handles the matter before recalibrating their contracts. The practicalities are the artery through which career consequences flow. Outside the conference room, someone in the communications team has already pulled up the file of Harrison Data Systems. A search yields the small press release from last Wednesday, with its abbreviated quote and a link to the corporate registry. The communications lead copies the link and prepares a note to the head of external relations. This moment, which began as a private humiliation, is already spilling into a larger ecology of facts and responses. Grant snakes a glance toward the door as if it might offer him an escape route. He focuses for a moment on the nameplate at the head of the table. It is polished and official. He thinks of how much time it took to get there. The right schools, the right partners, the right curt jokes that signal belonging. He had assumed those things were immovable. Maya looks at him only once more with an expression that contains no relish. "This is a business transaction," she says. "If there are operational concerns, let's address them. If there are conflicts, let's handle them transparently. I didn't make this to embarrass anyone. I made this because I believed in the product and because Benji wanted to focus on building instead of running administrative burdens." Her words reframe the moment from personal vengeance to pragmatic acquisition. That matters. It foils the easy counter-narrative that would paint her as petulant or vindictive. It is, in its way, an act of public virtue, the refusal to center emotion in a commercial event. For a room that watches posture closely, this is the better story. Grant fumbles an attempt at deflection. "We have partners to consider." He gestures vaguely at the client. His voice is tighter than it was a half hour ago. The client, a mid-level procurement lead, feels the ground shift under their feet. Business relationships are investments of risk. They now have to decide whether a small acquisition to a company they rely on introduces exposure. The procurement lead writes a note to their legal counsel. The counsel writes back, "Let's follow up. We need clarity on continuity." Business moves again in its ordinary, careful cadence. As the meeting disbands, people lingering by the coffee urns, pockets lighting up with messages, the immediate theater fades into a network of actions. Emails to be drafted, calls to be made, the legal team to be convened. The moment has not been resolved. It has been documented, and documentation demands response. That, more than the words themselves, will shape what happens next. The hallway outside smells of late lunch and the disinfectant of office cleaning. People pass the meeting room's glass walls now and slow to read the table's posture. Some look with curiosity, others with pity, a few with a private sense of triumph. Grant's laugh will not restore itself with a snap. There will be conversation, and that conversation will expose seams he had assumed were invisible. Maya steps out of the room last, folder under her arm, not because she wants to be watched, but because she knows people will be. Her walk is plain. There is no parade. She passes a mirror in the atrium, and for a moment looks at her reflection, the office lights making a halo at the rim of her hair. She takes that small moment to breathe. Mirrors, she has thought lately, show us what we want to see, and what we refuse to see. Grant has always used mirrors to admire himself. Today she used one to confirm a fact, that she had the paperwork, the escrow confirmation, and the legal counsel to support her claim. Ownership is a truth you can hand another person as evidence. It is, in a small way, a moral act. She hears the buzz of Slack channels as she walks, typing, tagging, the sound of attention being sewn into threads. She has created a rift, not a rout. That was exactly her intention. The work of changing a culture is incremental. It starts with being unwilling to tolerate small humiliations and scales into a broader conversation. But she also knows that real change requires structural commitment, policy, and often, people who will hold leaders accountable. A single acquisition will not rewrite a system, but it can force a discussion that would otherwise remain muffled. At her desk, a few messages await. A mentor writes, "Nicely done. Keep the high ground." A teammate writes a succinct congratulations. A friend sends a GIF, subtle, supportive. There are also quiet messages, old grievances surfacing, people asking for a private word. She answers them all with the same tone: practical, composed, careful. Grant's world narrows to damage control. He calls the head of corporate communications. He sends a terse message to a board member with a request to pull something together. He dials a longtime client. His voice is steady for the first few rings, then shows a tremor. He is learning in real time the unpleasant truth that status is fragile when confronted with legal clarity. For Maya, the victory is not a single point but a pivot. She has interrupted a ritual. She has shown that ownership can be quiet, and that facts, when placed in a public room, can cut through performance. She has also placed herself squarely in a field that will now watch her closely. For competence, for follow-through, for leadership. The stakes are higher. She knows that. She needs allies. She has them: Elena, Benji, a couple of quietly supportive partners, and now a set of skeptics to convert. In the corridor, a junior intern lingers to ask a question not about the acquisition, but about the tone of the meeting. "Do you think he'll be fired?" she asks, because popular narratives always want a finality they are rarely given. Maya smiles in a way that is both gentle and reserved. "I don't make personnel decisions," she says. "I make investments." The answer is precise. It refuses to indulge in schadenfreude. It refuses to treat a human's fall as sport. It redirects the conversation back to business. News, however, does not respect corporate boundaries for long. Within an hour, a terse message circulates to a subset of people. Pending, executive meeting, legal involved. Social threads will do the rest. The true test of the moment is not whether Grant is humiliated now, but whether the company learns anything. Will HR examine the patterns of microaggression? Will leadership training be implemented? Will clients see stability? The questions are structural, not personal. Maya returns to her desk and opens her calendar. There will be integration calls with Benji. There will be a meeting with legal to confirm client handoffs. There will be a brief with communications to ensure the messaging on the press release is clear and not inflammatory. She sets the first items, sends one-line confirmations, and then pulls up the registry entry again. The small satisfaction she allows herself is private. She does not savor Grant's discomfort because that would cheapen the work. She savors a document filed correctly in a system that recognizes facts. At the edge of the day, as the office begins to thin and city light cools into evening, the consequence of a single sentence has begun to spiral outward. The theater of power had its laugh. The ledger of ownership had its stamp. The difference between the two is a lesson in how change sometimes arrives, not as a shout, but as a recorded fact. Yet even as people sort facts, the social calculus continues. There are allies to shore up, clients to reassure, and a man who will not accept defeat quietly. Grant will mobilize. He will call confidants. He will try to frame the story. He will attempt to make the moment about process and not pattern. He will have resources and a network accustomed to smoothing over bumps. For Maya, the work must proceed with both clarity and care. She must press for accountability where necessary and not mistake one document for transformation. A reflection catches in the glass near her desk. The building's lights and her silhouette overlap like a double exposure. She thinks about mirrors again. The reflection Grant saw when he looked into a room and believed himself its center, and the reflection he must now reconcile with a public document that says otherwise. Power, she has learned, is less about who can shout and more about who can produce the file that makes shouting irrelevant. The rest will unfold in meetings, in memos, in legal footnotes, and in the slow, often messy work of culture change. But for a moment, in a room that had just laughed at her, a simple piece of paper had shifted the narrative. He had mocked a junior analyst. She had revealed that she bought his company last week. People will talk about that line, the cadence, the moment it landed. They will replay the clip and comment on the irony. But the truth, the documented truth, is quieter and more consequential than the laugh. It sits in a registry and an escrow, factual, dull, indelible. When the sun dips and the city lights rise, Grant is on his phone arranging counsel. The board will convene. There will be questions to answer. Maya closes her laptop and rises, feeling the sediment of a long day settle. This is not the end of the story. It is the hinge. She walks home through a street of glass towers where each reflective surface throws back 1,000 versions of what people want to be. Tonight, she allowed one of those reflections, the one that says, "You belong at the table," to be true. It cost months of work, a clean set of documents, and the courage to place a fact in front of a room that prefers theater to truth. In the quiet of the subway, she reads a single email from Benji. "Thank you for handling this with care." His words are small and grateful. She replies with a brief professional line. She has work to do. Ownership is operational, not symbolic. The train hums on. Somewhere back in the office, Grant sits in the dark of his dining room with a half-empty glass of wine, calculating strategies. His world of assumed invulnerability has been exposed to the light that notes and registries provide. He will fight in the language he knows. Emails, phone calls, polished memos. The fight will be procedural and public in equal measure. But for now, the night is silent and the registry is stamped. She bought his company last week. The sentence will travel through the company like a cold wind, and people will decide where they stand. The moment of humiliation is over. The moment of accountability has begun. In this story, dignity is a tactic as much as it is a stance. Maya's revelation was not theater. It was business. It was principle applied with legal force. It is the kind of answer that does not yell, but that rarely fails to be heard. Outside, a neon sign blinks above a diner. Open. Inside, conversations hum on unrelated topics. Power moves in those other rooms too, the ones not filled with suits and whispers. For now, Maya allows herself a small, private smile as the skyline blinks on. The reveal is done. The aftermath, messy and consequential, waits to be written. The next morning, the company's internal channels buzz like a hive disturbed. The Slack thread titled "All Hands" that had carried dry status updates now slicks with screenshots, questions, and a flurry of reactions. A trade newsletter posts a short item, neutral, factual, linking to the state registry and quoting the terse press release from Harrison Data Systems. The story blooms outward. A dozen reporters glance at the filing. A few of them tip the headline toward the dramatic. Social accounts stir. Colleagues who had been quiet overnight weigh in with cautious support or defensive silence. The market doesn't move because the acquisition is small, but attention is attention. Attention is its own kind of pressure. In a glassed meeting room 2 floors below the boardroom, the head of corporate communications drafts a memo that reads like nothing so much as triage. Legal wants language that limits exposure. HR compiles a timeline of previous complaints and notes. A partner from executive search emails with a curt offer to assist with contingency planning. The word investigation moves from a procedural category into everyone's vocabulary. It is both a shield and a threat, depending on where you sit. Grant places an early call to Mullins, the board member who had once praised his razor-sharp instincts at an industry dinner. The call is a string of defensive clarifications, arguments about tone and context, and, beneath it all, a jockeying for empathy. Mullins listens, his voice a measure of cold collegiality. "We will convene," he says. "We need facts." The board convenes that afternoon in a meeting that feels less formal and more like a triage room in a hospital. Urgent, a little clinical, trying to turn shock into policy. Elena and Benji are there to provide clarity on the transaction. HR lays out a pattern of complaints that, taken together, look less like isolated jokes and more like a consistency of behavior. The legal counsel explains the filing, what it proves and what it doesn't prove, and emphasizes that the transaction is lawful and properly recorded. What we have, the outside counsel says, is a recorded transfer of ownership. What we need to assess is whether any internal policy or conflict of interest protocols were engaged improperly, and whether the executive's behavior violated our code of conduct in a way that requires sanction. Board members trade looks. The decision that ends the day's meeting is procedural. Place Grant on administrative leave pending a formal inquiry by an independent firm. Suspend public comment from the company beyond acknowledging that an inquiry is underway. and notify clients that the company is addressing a matter of governance. It is a cautious, bureaucratic dance meant to buy time and to signal seriousness. Grant's immediate reaction is private fury. He using his network, late-night calls, rapid-fire texts to old allies, a polished memo to the communications team that frames the incident as a misinterpreted exchange. He tries to cast himself as the aggrieved party, lampooned in a public forum and stripped of process. His language attempts to reclaim narrative by leaning on the very institutions now turning the screws. Procedural fairness, due process, context. He is practiced at making the company believe that inconveniences are storms that always pass. Outside the company, the article picks up a human angle. Columnists write about an unlikely acquisition and a lesson in humility. Opinion pieces layer in broader questions. Is this about a single man's entitlement or about the structures that make such entitlement possible? The discourse is messy. Supporters of Maya frame the moment as a corrective. Critics worry that spectacle is replacing governance. The debate is predictable and shallow in equal measure, but it matters because it shapes how stakeholders react. Internally, the company's culture war starts. There are two kinds of response. Defensive solidarity for Grant, often couched in nostalgia for a leader who got things done, and a quieter, more languid recognition that small humiliations had been happening for years. A few mid-level managers who had once laughed at the same jokes now text each other in private. Did we know? Were we complicit? How do we proceed? The moral calculus is more complicated than it seems in a headline. Maya, as much as she has altered the field, is careful. She refuses to become a symbol in a public statement that could be read as retaliatory. She insists in private meetings that the focus be on the business, integration of Harrison data systems, continuity for clients, and a transparent process for any investigation. Her request is not evasive. It is strategic. She knows that moral clarity relies on procedural clarity. Public virtue without private discipline is a fragile thing. Elena, who has been an ally from the start, offers to present the legal timeline to the board and to any investigative team. She stresses that the sale was clean and that Benji's decision was voluntary. Benji, for his part, is quietly grateful and anxious. Founders rarely plan to be civic actors in corporate dramas. He is, however, resolute about product continuity. I sold because I wanted to build, he says in a brief statement to legal. Maya gave me the edge to do that. I stand by the transaction. The independent inquiry proceeds with a meticulous professionalism that lacks theater. Witness interviews are scheduled. Electronic records are subpoenaed internally. HR sits down with dozens of employees to map cultural patterns. The complaint timeline shows small repeated stings, a joke in a sales meeting, a corrective comment in front of clients, a public, helpful suggestion that acted as correction. The pattern suggests a leader who used public diminishment as currency, enforcing hierarchy by performance rather than merit. The board's interim decision is cautious. Grant is temporarily removed from client-facing responsibilities, his access to certain vendor negotiations restricted, and he is required to participate in a facilitated process to repair relationships with affected teams. The language avoids dramatic pronouncements. It is a slow-motion accountability. In the world of corporate governance, accountability often looks like policies and committees rather than dramatic firings. For Grant, the sting is personal as well as professional. His inbox fills with messages not of support, but with inquiries from partners wondering whether their projects with him should proceed. A long-term client asks whether the change affects delivery timelines. A recruitment firm that once promised to place him on a C-suite panel withdraws an invitation. Humiliation now arrives in calendar holes and unreturned requests. His social weather shifts. He is still privileged, his network still answers his calls, but the reflexive applause that used to greet him in rooms is quieter, measured. Meanwhile, Maya's inbox fills with a different kind of noise. Congratulatory notes mingle with requests for mentorship and wary messages from colleagues who are themselves concerned about future interactions. The transition is not all positive. Some colleagues whisper about whether she is too political. A few wonder if the acquisition will lead to turf battles over procurement and vendor relationships. She anticipated some of this. She answers with clarity. Her goal is integration, continuity, and to protect clients and employees from disruption. In the weeks that follow, the company's PR team crafts a measured statement. The board is conducting an independent review. Operations continue. The company remains committed to respectful workplace standards. Investors are placated with a call on governance. Clients are reassured with continuity plans and direct points of contact. The corporate machinery, legal, compliance, communications, moves to contain reputational spillover. But containment is never total. The human stories continue to leak. The inquiry ultimately finds that while no single illegal act occurred, the pattern of public diminishment by Grant created a culture that tolerated microaggressions, and that the board had, at times, been slow to correct it. The language of the report is careful. The conduct falls short of expected leadership standards and has caused measurable harm to team cohesion. The recommended sanctions are procedural but meaningful. Removal from the CSO title, reassignment away from client-facing leadership, mandatory leadership coaching, and close monitoring of future conduct by a governance committee. The board, sensitive to fallout and to both legal and commercial considerations, offers Grant a negotiated exit package with options: accept reassignment or step down with a severance agreement. He chooses to resign. There is no theatrical scene of dismissal. There is instead a formal letter, a recorded acceptance of the board's decision, and a carefully worded final communication to staff that describes a transition in leadership. Grant's last week is a collage of statements and reconciliations, some public, some private. He makes a brief internal post thanking colleagues and warning of no easy answers. The post earns a mix of likes and cold silence. He leaves with the trappings of seniority, but without the sphere of authority he once took for granted. His professional exile is soft around the edges, still cushioned by compensation and reputation networks, but the center of gravity of his career shifts. Maya watches the process with an evenness that is quiet but not passive. She attends a board meeting to discuss the Harrison integration, not as a sword wielder but as an operator. She maps out client transitions, integration checklists, and risk assessments. Her leadership is judged not by a single sentence but by the steady drum of execution. In private, she meets with HR and with other junior employees who have confided in her. She finds herself, unexpectedly, in a mentoring role. People begin to ask how she managed the acquisition, and she answers in procedural terms: due diligence, fair offer, legal clarity. She stresses competence and discipline over bravado. The company, feeling the heat of public scrutiny, launches a slate of measures that are both symbolic and operational: an anonymous reporting channel for microaggressions, mandatory leadership training focusing on inclusive management, and an external audit of procurement and vendor approval processes. These are small incremental changes. They are easier to announce than to implement. A culture of real reform takes longer. Months later, the HR team reports modest but measurable improvement in the reporting and follow-through of grievances. A task force is created, chaired jointly by HR and an outside governance consultant, to recommend structural changes, clearer performance metrics that reduce emphasis on theatrical displays of leadership, a review of promotion criteria to value inclusive mentorship, and a procurement rotation policy to reduce single-point influence over vendor decisions. The policies are not revolutionary, but they are practical. They become, in their own unglamorous way, instruments that shift incentives. Public reaction to the measures is mixed. Advocacy groups praise the move as a sign that reputational risk can force corporate introspection. Skeptics call it a PR play. They note that the company's market position did not tumble, and that wealthy executives often leave with cushioned exits. Both critiques hold truth. Systems of power do not fall because one person is asked to leave. They yield to sustained pressure and structural redesign. Maya knows this. Her own victory was an instrument, not an endpoint. As the months pass, Harrison's software is integrated into the company's offering. Benji returns to focus on product. His customer relationships migrate under new account leads. Some clients express appreciation for continuity. Others remain cautious, watching renewal cycles closely. Operationally, the acquisition proves itself as one more line in a ledger. Useful, but not miraculous. The real afterwork is in the PR and personnel architecture that frames future interactions. Maya's role in this integration earns her a promotion. Head of Analytics Integration, a position that recognizes both her technical competence and her capacity to manage cross-functional friction. The promotion is accompanied by a new set of obligations, more visibility, and a heavier calendar. She accepts, aware that promotion comes with both power and scrutiny. Grant, after a period of public silence, posts reflections on professional decorum and the hazards of social media. He understates the problem and frames his experience as a lesson in context. Some former allies reply with supportive notes, others remain distant. He moves into advisory roles, accepts speaking engagements that pay well, and reorients his career towards smaller leadership roles outside the glare. The fall is partial, not catastrophic. It is real, though. The center he once occupied is altered. For Maya, the change is less about retribution than about the rearrangement of opportunity and responsibility. She navigates the new role with the same precision that informed her acquisition: checklists, stakeholder calls, and a steady insistence that clients be prioritized over spectacle. She refuses invitations to turn her story into performative content. She does, however, meet with junior staff, offering practical advice about negotiating authority without theatrics. Document your work, build quiet alliances, and keep the ledger of your contributions. In department meetings afterward, the company culture shifts in tone. Micro-patronizing jokes are called out, sometimes awkwardly. People learn new language for old offenses. That comment undermines inclusion. And then, over time, learn to interpret the language into action. Concrete steps, not just pronouncements. The pace is uneven. Some leaders internalize the changes genuinely. Others treat them as compliance tasks. Policy is a map, not a terrain. It points the way but does not guarantee travel. Outside the firm, the story becomes a case study. Business schools include a short module about the incident in ethics classes. Consultants point to the episode as an example of how soft power, the ability to humiliate to shape atmospheres, can be as consequential as formal authority. Debates linger. Did the punishment fit the offense? Were the consequences proportional? Is ownership a sufficient corrective to entitlement? People argue, because arguments are how institutions understand themselves. Maya's daily life in the months that follow is simply work with new margins. She oversees the product roadmap for Harrison's modules, meets weekly with Benji to ensure the build remains intact, and drafts integration memos for clients who want clarity. She receives occasional invitations to speak, panels, small conferences, where she frames the lesson in a grounded way. Emphasize competence, insist on process, know the mechanisms of how business works. She does not allow the moment to harden into identity. The scandal becomes a vector for steady practice. There are costs. Her social media invites increase. Some old colleagues respond to the narrative with assumptions. There are still meetings where the echo of that initial laugh lingers. There are late nights when she replays conversations and wonders if she acted in the best possible way. The victory is not a balm. It is a responsibility. She steps into it. Grant's personal trajectory continues to illustrate complexity. Removed from the perch of visible power, he confronts a mirror that is less flattering. In private, he does not transform overnight. He hires coaches, reads books about leadership, sends conciliatory notes. Some notes are sincere, some are defensive. The people who once benefited from proximity to him are forced to reevaluate their own roles in sustaining the behavior that was normalized for so long. A few apologize. Others remain unrepentant. The culture is a mosaic of choices. Months later, an industry summit invites a panel on governance. The board member Mullins speaks about the company's response in sober, managerial terms. Governance needs structures that act before moments escalate. An external ethics consultant presents a framework for decentering disruptive personalities in favor of distributed leadership. The panel is not melodramatic. It is practical. The conversation moves from personalities to protocols, vendor rotation, anonymized feedback loops, clearer escalation channels. These mechanics, boring as they sound, decrease the likelihood that a single voice can define culture. There is a small private scene that matters. One afternoon, Maya visits Harrison's old development floor, Benji's team cobbled together in a converted corner of the building, and watches a product demo. Developers crowd around. The screens show lines of code, a dashboard that tests cleanly. A junior developer jokes about the fierce first week under the new integration. Benji smiles. Maya reminds the team that the acquisition was meant to free him to build, not to wage war. The team laughs and the moment is ordinary and pure. For Maya, that ordinary work is the real victory. Product shipping, customer served, and the small dignity of people being able to do their jobs without the shadow of a humiliating authority. The media cycle eventually moves on. The trade pieces become footnotes in a longer career arc for many involved. Yet inside the company, the echo remains. The board publishes an annual governance update that cites the episode as one impetus for reform. HR reports show improvements in reporting rates and in resolution time for complaints. The company institutes a mentorship program that pairs senior leaders with diverse junior colleagues, and the program is measured for impact. The changes are incremental and incomplete, but they are real. Maya's reflection on those months is measured. She keeps a small journal now, not as a trophy but as a ledger of lessons. She writes about timing, about dignity, and about the quiet arithmetic of ownership. She thinks often about mirrors, about how people choose which reflection to admire and which to avoid. Grant had always admired himself in rooms, in laughter. She had gone to the registry, to legal, to counsel, not to humiliate but to change the terms of conversation. On the anniversary of the filing, there is no public fanfare. No one throws a party. The desk calendar marks the date quietly. Maya sits at her desk and reviews a project plan. A colleague stops by to ask a technical question. The day passes like many others, filled with calls, decisions, and small kindnesses. The work continues. Years from that first moment of laughter, attorneys and governance experts will point to the case as an example of how nonviolent, legal actions can expose the fragility of authority that depends on intimidation rather than competence. There will be dissenting views, as there always are in a public conversation about power. Some will argue that the consequences were disproportionate. Others will say they were long overdue. The real test, as Maya always believed, is not in the spectacle of momentary reversal, but in whether the company learns to reduce the conditions that allowed the mockery in the first place. She rarely replays the initial exchange. When people ask about it, she speaks in practical terms: due diligence, integration, fairness to a founder. She emphasizes that the point was never to topple a person for spectacle's sake, but to insist that dignity be the default. "We aren't fixated on revenge," she tells a small group of new hires once. "We're focused on creating systems where small humiliations don't compound into career damage." For Grant, the mirror remains complicated. He leaves the company with some doors gently closed and others cautiously open. He will appear at conferences, sometimes contrite, sometimes defiant. He begins, after a time, to recognize the ways in which his instinct to command the room had hardened into a habit that cost him trust. Whether he truly changes or only reinvents himself is a story without a neat ending. Maya, in her quiet way, understands that a single acquisition did not fix a culture. It did, however, force a reflection. It introduced a fact that could no longer be laughed away. She continues to build, to mentor, and to press for incremental reforms that make the workplace less cruel and more procedural, where dispute resolution is not dependent on the social standing of the complainant. One evening, months after the incident, she meets Elena and Benji for coffee. They talk less about boardrooms and more about simple things: product roadmaps, childcare schedules, the small pleasures of a job well done. The conversation is ordinary and restorative. As they part, Elena says simply, "You did the right thing." Maya smiles, not because of praise, but because the work ahead feels doable. The city lights pull at the glass towers as she walks home, and her mind returns to a single image that had startled her that day. Grant's laugh, a sound meant to authenticate him, and the quiet registry stamp that unraveled it. Power, she thinks, is not always loud. Sometimes it is a small fact placed in a public room. Sometimes it's a quiet file stamped in a registry. Sometimes it's a refusal to be diminished. He once mocked her. She had, in the company of others, revealed that she bought his company last week. The sentence traveled through the building and into the larger world like a cold wind. It did not end everything. It began something. A long, messy process of accountability and a modest recalibration of how authority is recognized. This is not a story about total ruin or sudden salvation. It is about the ways dignity and patience and procedural clarity can intersect to force a mirror into the hand of a man who had accustomed himself to seeing only his own reflection. It is about how justice in a corporate world often comes in documents and meetings rather than in triumphalist moments. It is about quiet persistence. If this story made you think about the ways power is exercised in your own workplace, subscribe and join the conversation. Was his downfall deserved or too harsh? Tell us in the comments.